The afternoon lay heavy over the plains, the kind of heat that made even the cicadas hold their breath between songs. The land was open in every direction, a sheet of sun-baked grass rippling in faint gusts, and the railway line cut through it like a silver blade. Charles rode slow along the service track, his bay's ears twitching at flies, his mind half on the feed bill in his saddlebag, and half on the quiet that seemed to stretch without end. Then it came, a sound so sharp and raw it seemed to tear the air in two. Not the cry of a hawk or the shriek of a wagon wheel, but human, high-pitched, desperate. His head snapped toward the horizon, the brim of his hat casting a darker shadow over his eyes. He urged the horse forward, the animal's hooves drumming a faster rhythm against the baked earth. A second scream followed, thinner now, as though strained past breaking. The faint hum of the rails underfoot reached his ears, a vibration that crawled up from the ground into his bones. Somewhere ahead, the air carried the distant whistle of a train, still small but growing. He leaned low, letting the bay stretch into a gallop, the wind slapping at his shirt sleeves. Dust rose in ragged clouds, stinging his eyes, but through it he saw movement, two shapes by the tracks. At first, the light played tricks. He thought it was a bundle of laundry, tossed by the wind. Then the shapes sharpened. A woman in a torn dress, hair matted to her face, her arms drawn unnaturally away from her body. Her wrists were bound to one rail, her ankles to the other. On her chest, wrapped in a faded strip of cloth, was a newborn, its tiny head barely visible, a tuft of dark hair against her skin. Charles's gut tightened. He could already see the heat shimmer bending the horizon, could almost picture the train's shadow spilling long before the engine itself appeared. The whistle sounded again, closer, sharper, and the metal hum of the tracks grew into a quickened heartbeat beneath him. He was off the horse before it stopped moving, boots hitting hard, knife already in hand. The woman's eyes found his, wild, terror-bright, yet holding a strange steadiness. Her lips moved, soundless in the roar of his pulse, but her gaze flicked down toward the child. He dropped to one knee, cutting the bindings around the bundle first. The baby gave a thin, reedy cry, a sound too small for the danger rushing toward them. The knot at her wrists was tight, frayed rope biting deep into her skin. He sliced through it, then the ties at her ankles. The low rumble of the train was a living thing now, vibrating through the ground, pressing into his knees. Somewhere beyond the dust, a black engine's shape began to loom, growing impossibly fast. He pulled her upright, but her legs buckled at once. With no time to test her strength, he hauled her against his chest, baby cradled in one arm, her weight against the other. The train's horn screamed, a predator's cry, and he turned from the rails, running hard for the dry grass beyond. The air tore past them as the engine roared by, a wall of steel and steam that rattled his teeth. Heat and grit slapped at his face, and the ground shuddered beneath each car. They were barely 20 paces from the track when the last car streaked past, leaving the sharp smell of iron and coal in its wake. He lowered her onto a patch of scrub, easing her down so the baby stayed nestled close. Her breath came ragged, her skin pale beneath the sunburn. She looked at him then, not with thanks, not yet, but with something deeper, a wordless question she wasn't ready to speak aloud. The baby whimpered, a thin sound in the vast open, and she drew it closer, her lips pressing to its forehead. He saw her hands tremble as they brushed the child's cheek, saw the rope burns striping her wrists. Charles crouched beside her, the shadow of his hat falling over both mother and child. The sun had slipped lower now, softening the light to amber, but the heat still pressed heavy on them. He wanted to ask her name, where she had come from, who had left her there. But the sharp edge of the moment hadn't dulled yet, and the dust of the train still hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Instead, he said, in a low and steady voice, "We'll get you safe." Her eyes closed at that, and her body sagged slightly, as though those few words had released some inner grip. She didn't speak again, only shifted her arm to make sure the baby was fully covered from the sun. Then, like a candle whose flame had burned too long, she slipped into unconsciousness. He checked her breathing, steady, though shallow, and adjusted his grip on the bundle that was her child. The tiny girl's eyes were closed, her mouth moving faintly in sleep. Charles's throat tightened at the sight, though he could not have said why. He rose, gathering both into his arms once more. His bay stood where he'd left it, reins trailing in the dust, ears flicking toward him, as though aware that something more than mere passengers were approaching. The weight of them was solid against him, not heavy, but grounding. He swung into the saddle with the care of a man who had carried broken things before. The woman's head rested against his shoulder now, the baby a warm knot between them. As they turned away from the railway, the open land stretched ahead, miles of sunlit emptiness leading toward the low, weathered shape of his ranch on the far rise. The rails ran parallel for a time, gleaming under the late light, then curved away into the horizon, carrying their noise and their danger with them. The only sound now was the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the faint, even breaths of the two lives he carried. Charles glanced once over his shoulder toward the place where he had found them. The dust was already settling, leaving no sign of the struggle, only the memory of screams swallowed by the wind. He faced forward again, urging the bay into a smooth, steady lope. The sky above them was deepening toward evening, the air cooling enough to carry the scent of dry sage from the flats. The sun was lowering fast, and he knew they would reach the ranch just as the shadows began to pool. Somewhere in the silence, a thought settled into him like a stone in clear water. The tracks might run straight, but life never did. And this crossing, theirs and his, was only the beginning. The sun was dipping toward the far ridge by the time Charles saw the worn boards of his ranch house rise against the sky. Heat still clung to the air, but the shadows were stretching, cooling the earth in long fingers. His bay's steady gait slowed as they reached the yard, dust curling up around the hooves before drifting away. Charles swung down carefully, keeping the woman and her child close against him. Mary was already at the porch, her skirt brushing her ankles, eyes sharp beneath the shade of her bonnet. She had heard the hoofbeats, perhaps felt them in her bones as she worked in the garden. Without asking, she came forward, her gaze dropping to the bundle in his arms. He passed the baby to her first. Mary's hands, worn but sure, cradled the child as though she had been waiting her whole life for the moment. Jane whimpered softly, and Mary's voice, a low, rhythmic hum, seemed to soothe her instantly. Charles carried the woman inside, his boots heavy against the old floorboards, and laid her gently on the narrow bed in the guest room. The lamplight caught the red of the rope burns on her wrists, the dust still tangled in her hair. Mary followed, the baby now settled in the crook of her arm, and began to work without a word, fetching a basin of water, tearing strips from an old linen shirt to clean the wounds. Charles stood in the doorway, hat in hand, watching as she wiped the grime from the woman's face and neck, pausing to be sure each breath came steady. When the water turned murky in the bowl, Mary wrung out the cloth and looked at him. "She's been through something bad," she said softly. "It's a mercy you found her when you did." He didn't answer, only stepped back to give her room. The smell of the land, dust, horse sweat, sun-warmed leather, still clung to him, but underneath it was something sharper, the memory of coal smoke and metal screaming past. Hours slipped into night. Outside, the cicadas sang their endless summer chorus, but inside the house, the rooms were hushed except for the faint creak of the rocking chair in the corner. Mary sat there with Jane, the baby's tiny chest rising and falling in the rhythm of deep sleep. Anna stirred near midnight, eyes blinking against the lamplight. Her hand moved instinctively to her chest, seeking the weight of her child. When she saw Mary with Jane, a tension in her face eased. She tried to sit up, but the effort drew a soft hiss of pain from between her lips. Charles stepped into the room, his shadow stretching across the floor. "You're safe here," he said quietly, the words carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested. She looked at him for a long moment, as if measuring the truth of it. Then, without speaking, she nodded and let her head sink back into the pillow. The next day dawned pale and warm, the air already shimmering before noon. Charles worked in the yard, mending a section of the corral fence, but his eyes drifted often to the open window of the guest room. From there, he caught glimpses of Anna sitting on the edge of the bed, cradling Jane, her movements slow but deliberate, like someone learning each gesture anew. Mary brought her broth and bread at midday. Anna accepted it with a quiet murmur, her voice thin but steady. She ate little, feeding Jane first, and when Mary stepped out, Charles noticed how her gaze followed the older woman, a watchfulness, as though still unsure how long such kindness might last. By late afternoon, she had ventured to the porch. Jane slept against her shoulder, wrapped in a clean cloth Mary had found in a cedar chest. Anna's eyes moved over the wide pasture, the low hills beyond, and the faint glimmer of the rail line in the distance. Her expression was unreadable, though a shadow passed across it when her gaze lingered too long toward that horizon. Charles came up the steps, his hands still smelling faintly of cedar shavings from the tack room. "How's the little one?" he asked, keeping his tone even. "She sleeps," Anna said, her voice little more than a whisper. There was no hesitation in her answer, but no invitation either. She shifted Jane slightly, as if shielding her from the evening breeze. The days settled into a pattern. Anna rose early, as if habit had taught her that daylight could be stolen from her at any moment. She washed her face in the basin, smoothed her dress, and tended to Jane before herself. She spoke little, but her eyes followed the rhythm of the ranch, the sweep of Charles moving through chores, the quiet way Mary handled each task, the boy Jed darting in and out with water buckets or stray bits of news. Once, Charles caught sight of Jed leaving a handful of wildflowers on the windowsill. Anna found them later and held them in her lap for a long time, fingers tracing each fragile petal. On the third evening, a thin wind picked up from the west, carrying with it the smell of far-off smoke. The sun was low, bleeding amber across the sky, when Charles noticed Anna standing by the fence, Jane against her chest, staring toward the horizon again. He walked over, slow so as not to startle her. "Something out there?" he asked. Her fingers tightened on the cloth around Jane. "It's just too open," she said finally, eyes not leaving the distant line of land. "Too easy to be seen." He followed her gaze but saw nothing moving, only the long stretch of grass, bending and rising under the wind's hand. "You're safe here," he said again, though he knew that safety was not a thing given once and kept forever. She glanced at him then, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since that day on the tracks. Whatever she read there seemed to hold her still for a moment, before she looked back toward the distance. Night came on slow, stars pricking through the deepening blue. Charles watched from the porch as she carried Jane inside, the lamplight catching briefly in her hair before the door closed. The yard was quiet, but for the rustle of the wind through dry grass. In that stillness, he knew the danger that had left her on those rails had not vanished with the train. It was out there somewhere in the wide dark, perhaps already drawing closer. He leaned against the porch post, the boards warm beneath his palms from the day's sun, and let the quiet settle around him. The sound of Jane's soft cry reached him faintly through the open window, followed by Anna's low, steady voice, almost a lullaby. Something about that sound, fragile yet enduring, rooted itself in him. It was not gratitude she offered, nor trust, not yet. But it was a beginning. And beginnings, he knew, could be enough to build on, if one had the patience to wait. The heat had shifted by the fourth morning, softening into a hazy warmth that carried the scent of dry sage through the open windows. Anna was on the porch, Jane in her lap, when Mary joined her with a basket of mending. For a while they worked in silence, Mary's needle dipping in and out of cloth, Anna's fingers gently rocking the baby. Then, as if the quiet had worn thin, Anna began to speak. Her voice was hesitant at first, the words fragile as moth wings. She told Mary she had come west to join her husband, believing the promise in his letters. But when she arrived, heavy with child, she found he had taken another woman. His kin had looked at her with the coldness of strangers. They called her a burden, a mistake that needed correcting. She paused then, as if deciding whether to say more. Her eyes fixed on the hills beyond the pasture, far from Mary's gaze. After Jane's birth, she said, they had taken her in the night, binding her to the rails. It was meant to be quick. The train would do what they did not wish to bloody their hands with. Her tone was flat, but the tremor in it betrayed the memory's sharpness. Mary's hands stilled over the mending. "You're safe now," she said softly, though both women knew safety was not so easily secured. Charles heard most of it from the far end of the porch, where he had been oiling the hinges of the screen door. He kept his eyes on the work, but each word marked him. There was a heaviness in his chest, not just from anger but from the knowledge that such cruelty could be carried out with such deliberate calm. Later that day, while Charles was in town for supplies, Tom Weller, the storekeeper, leaned across the counter and lowered his voice. Two men had been asking after a young woman with a baby. One was stocky, with a dark beard, the other thin and sharp-eyed. They'd ridden in from the east, spent money freely, and left in the direction of the rail spur. Tom didn't ask questions, but his gaze told Charles he thought trouble might be following. Charles rode home slower than usual, mind weighing the news. By the time the ranch came into view, the sun was leaning low and long shadows striped the yard. He saw Anna through the open window, standing over Jane's cradle. Her hand hovered above the child's head, as though she were afraid to touch, but unable not to. That night over supper, Charles told Mary and Anna about the men. He kept his voice level, matter of fact, but he watched Anna closely. She didn't flinch, but her grip on the cup in her hands tightened enough for her knuckles to pale. She looked down into her stew as though the steam could hide her thoughts. After the meal, while Mary cleared the table, Charles found Anna on the porch. Jane was asleep, swaddled in the cloth Charles had brought from town a few days before. Anna's gaze was fixed on the yard, but he had the sense she wasn't seeing it. "They won't come here without meeting me first," he said. Her eyes flicked toward him. "And if they do?" "Then they leave," he replied simply, the certainty in his voice not forced but grounded, as though he had already decided the outcome. For the next few days, a quiet watchfulness settled over the ranch. Charles made a habit of checking the far fences himself, taking longer routes that gave him a view of the road from every angle. Jed was sent to the west pasture more often, both to keep him occupied and to keep him near enough to bring word if riders approached. Anna stayed close to the house, but she began to move with more steadiness, tending to Jane without the hesitations of those first days. Charles noticed the way she tucked the blanket around the cradle just so, the way she hummed under her breath when the baby stirred. Small things, but they rooted her more firmly in the space around her. One afternoon, while repairing a loose shutter, Charles heard the sound of water sloshing in the basin by the porch. He looked over to see Anna rinsing a thin cloth, her hair pulled back loosely, the sunlight catching in it. Jane lay nearby on a folded quilt, eyes wide, fingers curling at the air. When Anna caught Charles watching, she didn't look away this time. Instead, she said, "I've never been anywhere I could rest without thinking about leaving." Her voice carried no question, but the weight of a confession. He set down the hammer. "You don't have to think about that here." She gave a faint smile, small, almost reluctant, but it reached her eyes before fading again. Toward evening, Charles took the bay out along the ridge to check the line, where the property met the old cattle trail. From there, the land rolled away into a long, dusty expanse, and he could see the rail line glinting faintly in the dying light. Two dark specks moved along it, slow but steady, toward town. When he returned, the lamps were lit in the house and Mary was at the stove. Anna sat at the table, Jane in her arms, her gaze on the flicker of the lamp flame. Charles said nothing of what he'd seen, but he cleaned his rifle that night, oiling each part with deliberate care. The air felt heavier the next day, as if the weather itself were holding its breath. Anna seemed to sense it too. Her movements were brisker, her eyes sharper toward the windows. Charles found her at one point standing by the doorway, rocking Jane while looking out toward the distant road. That evening, the sky blushed red along the horizon before fading into the deep blue of night. Charles stood on the porch, leaning against the post, listening to the quiet. Then he heard it, the faint thud of hoofbeats, far enough away to be mistaken for wind against the earth, but too steady to be anything else. Anna stepped out behind him, Jane in her arms. She said nothing, but her presence was enough for him to glance her way. Her face was pale in the lamplight, but her eyes held steady on the dark beyond the yard. The hoofbeats faded after a time, swallowed by distance. Yet neither of them moved for a long while. The air was thick with unspoken things. Fear, yes, but also the strange understanding that they now shared the same threshold. When at last Anna turned to go inside, she paused in the doorway. "It won't be over until they come," she said quietly, almost to herself. Charles met her gaze. "Then we'll be ready." The words hung there between them, as certain as the stars now burning overhead, as uncertain as the path those hoofbeats might take next. The dawn broke muted, a pale wash of light over the ridge, the kind that seemed to carry no warmth. The air was still, as if even the wind waited to see what the day would bring. Charles was already in the yard, checking the latch on the corral gate, when he spotted Jed riding hard from the far pasture. The boy's hat was pulled low, dust streaming off his horse in a long tail. Charles's grip on the gate tightened. "They're coming," Jed called before he'd even reached the yard, voice high and breathless. Two men, maybe more behind them. One's got a shotgun. Charles gave a curt nod and sent him straight to Mary with orders to stay inside and keep Anna and Jane out of sight. Jed slid from the saddle and disappeared into the house, the door shutting quick behind him. Charles crossed the yard to the barn, moving with the calm precision of a man who knew panic was a luxury. He took his rifle from its rack, checked the chamber, then stepped into the open with the slow certainty of someone who'd made his decision long before this morning. By the time the riders came into view, the sun was clearing the hills, throwing their shadows long ahead of them. Dust boiled up from the trail in their wake. They reined in at the gate, eyes sweeping the yard. One was broad-shouldered with a beard that looked like it had been cut with a knife. The other had the thin, sharp features of a man always looking for a fight to start. "We're here for the woman," the bearded one said, his voice carrying across the yard. "She's got no right to that child. Hand her over." Charles didn't move from his place in the dirt, rifle resting easy in his hands. "You're on my land," he said, voice low but clear. "And you'll be leaving the same way you came." The thin one spat into the dust. "You think you can keep her? You don't know who you're dealing with." "I don't need to," Charles replied, the barrel of the rifle angling slightly toward the ground, though there was no mistaking the readiness in his stance. "You cross that gate, and you'll find out exactly who you're dealing with." The bearded man shifted in his saddle, eyes flicking toward the house. "We can do this the easy way, or the hard." The sound of the rifle's hammer being drawn back cut through his words. It was a quiet sound, but it settled into the space between them like a stone in water. The thin one's smirk faltered. Inside, Anna stood just behind the lace curtain. Jane clutched to her chest. Her heart thudded so hard she thought it might wake the baby. Through the gap in the fabric, she saw Charles standing alone in the yard, hat brim shading his eyes, the morning light outlining the solid line of his shoulders. The men shifted in their saddles again, uneasy now, the weight of the silence pressing against them. The bearded one muttered something low to his companion. The thin man glanced toward the horizon, then back at Charles, calculating the distance between them. "You'll regret this," the bearded man said finally, his voice losing some of its edge. "I doubt it," Charles answered. They turned their horses, slow at first, then faster as they rode back the way they'd come. Dust rose in their wake, hanging in the air long after they'd vanished over the ridge. Charles stood where he was until the last trace of movement was gone. Only then did he lower the rifle and walk back toward the porch. Anna stepped outside before he reached the steps. Her face was pale, but her eyes held steady on his. "You risked yourself for me," she said softly. He shook his head once. "For both of you." For a moment, neither moved. The baby shifted in her arms, letting out a small, sleepy sigh. Charles's gaze dropped to Jane, then back to Anna, something unspoken passing between them. Mary opened the door, letting the warm smell of baking bread spill into the morning. "They'll be back," she said quietly, as though voicing what they all knew. "Maybe," Charles replied. "But they won't find her alone." The day wore on in a slow rhythm, though the air carried a charge that made every creak of the windmill sound sharper. Charles kept to his chores but stayed close to the house, the rifle never far from reach. Anna moved about quietly, her steps lighter now, though whether from relief or resolve, he couldn't tell. As the sun sank toward the horizon, painting the sky in long strokes of gold and rust, Charles sat on the porch steps. Anna joined him after a while, Jane asleep in her arms, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. They watched the last light fade together, neither speaking. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its cry carrying across the darkening land. Charles felt the weight of the moment settle into him, not as a burden, but as a promise he knew he'd keep. In the quiet that followed, Anna's fingers brushed his arm, a small, almost accidental touch, but one that lingered. He didn't move away. The night deepened, stars pricking through the velvet sky. The house behind them was still, the air between them steady. Somewhere beyond the hills, there might be hoofbeats again. But here, for now, there was only the sound of their breathing, and the knowledge that whatever came next, they would face it from the same side of the gate. The weeks that followed carried a strange mixture of stillness and vigilance. The men who had come to the gate did not return, but their absence did not feel like peace, more like the hush before a storm decides whether it will break. Charles went about his work with the same measured pace, but his eyes always traveled to the ridges and roads, reading the land as a man reads the surface of a river for hidden currents. Anna began to walk the yard in the cooler hours of morning, Jane swaddled against her chest. At first, her steps seemed cautious, as though she still expected some invisible boundary to stop her. But as the days passed, her stride lengthened, her shoulders eased, and her gaze lingered longer on the sweep of the pasture, the distant cottonwoods by the creek. Mary often joined her, pointing out the early blooms in the garden, or the line of quail moving through the tall grass. These small acts tethered her here, thread by thread. One evening, Charles returned from the far pasture to find Anna sitting on the porch steps, Jane asleep in her arms, the light of the setting sun turning her hair to a copper glow. She looked up at him, and there was no guardedness in her eyes, only a quiet recognition, as if she had been waiting for him to see her this way. "They won't come back," she said, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Maybe not," he replied, taking the step beside her. "But if they do, they'll find we're ready." Her fingers brushed the edge of his sleeve. It was not a deliberate gesture, but it stayed there a moment longer than accident would allow. She didn't pull back until Jane stirred, sighing in her sleep. As the days shortened and the air grew gentler with the shift toward autumn, Mary brought up the matter of the preacher. "He'll be riding through next Sunday," she said one afternoon while shelling beans at the table. "Could be the right time to make things certain." Her eyes flicked to Charles, then to Anna, but she didn't press. Anna hesitated. "I've had vows before," she said quietly. "They were broken before they even had the chance to mean something." Charles didn't answer right away. He was at the stove, pouring coffee, but he turned then, his gaze steady. "Vows aren't the words," he said. "They're the living of them. We've already started." The room was still for a heartbeat, save for the soft shifting of Jane in her cradle. Anna's eyes lowered, but there was no refusal in her face, only the slow reckoning of someone weighing what she had lost against what she might still hold. By the end of the week, the decision had settled between them without formal agreement. On Sunday morning, the air was bright and clear, the wind moving lightly through the cottonwoods. Mary had found a dress for Anna, pale blue and simple, and spent the evening before taking in the seams. Jane wore a white bonnet that Mary had kept folded away for years. The preacher arrived on horseback, dust clinging to his coat. He greeted Charles with a firm nod, Mary with a warm smile, and Anna with the kind of gentleness that did not pity but respected. They stood under the cottonwood by the creek, its leaves whispering overhead. The vows were spoken in low voices, meant more for each other than the air around them. Charles's promise was plain and unwavering: to keep her and Jane safe, to be a man she could lean on. Anna's voice was softer, but there was a steadiness to it as she promised to walk beside him, not behind, not hidden. When it was done, the preacher clasped their joined hands and stepped back. There was no applause, no grand display, just the sound of the creek running over its stones and the breeze moving through the leaves. They ate together afterward in the yard, roast chicken, cornbread, and Mary's apple pie. Jed chased the chickens for sport, his laughter carrying over the grass. Jane slept in the cedar cradle Charles had built himself, the scent of fresh wood still clinging to it. As the sun began to lower, the shadows stretched long across the pasture. Anna stood at the edge of the porch, watching Charles speak with the preacher by the corral. Her fingers rested lightly on the porch rail, her face calm in a way it had never been when she first came here. When Charles returned to her side, she reached for his hand without hesitation. "I didn't think I'd ever belong anywhere again," she said. "You do now," he answered simply. They stood together as the last of the light sank behind the hills, Jane's quiet breathing rising from the cradle between them. The land around them lay in that rare moment between day and night, when everything seems to hold still. Somewhere in the far distance, a hawk called once before settling into silence. The air was warm, the kind of warmth that stays in the skin even after the sun is gone. Anna leaned into Charles, and he rested his arm around her, the gesture natural, unforced. There would be more days to face, more ridges to watch, perhaps even more shadows on the horizon. But for now, the gate was closed, the yard was theirs, and the road ahead, however uncertain, would be walked side by side. And for the first time since the rails had sunk beneath her, Anna felt no need to look over her shoulder. "Dear friends, now tell me, where in the world are you watching from? If this story touched your heart, give it a like and share your thoughts below. Click on the video on your screen for another tale even deeper than this one. You'll feel it linger. Come along. I'll be waiting by the fire for the next story.